This is video on friction. This is the first video where we are going to talk something about basics. Let's understand the concept. Look at these two bodies and these two surfaces. Now, even if apparently the surfaces look smooth, and but you examine them under microscope, you will always find some irregularities. Okay. Now, when you place it on this and try to move, let's say, towards your right, naturally these irregularities are going to get interlocked, and a resistance will be created to this tendency of pulling, and that resisting force is called friction. So we can say friction is caused by interlocking of irregularities of two surfaces when one surface tries to move with respect to other. Now we are not getting into very fundamental definition from the fundamental physics of friction, but we are trying to just understand pragmatic concept in a pragmatic manner, that what exactly is the frictional force and why is it caused. So this can be the good reasoning for that. Okay. Now what is important is frictional force is developed at the surface, and if two surfaces are just kept on each other without attempt to move one surface against other, then there will be no friction at the surface. I just keep it. I don't try to move it. Let's say this force is 0. Then even if there are irregularities, even if the two surfaces are in contact, there is no friction. Only when attempt is made to move one surface against other, frictional force, which is resisting in nature, opposes such attempt. And if the upper body doesn't move, then this comes under static friction. Whereas if this applied force moving one surface against other is continuously increased, then static frictional force, which is here, is exceeded and relative motion between the two surfaces is caused. But even in the motion, frictional force does exist at the surface, and then we are getting into dynamic friction. This is the broad and concept of friction. This is a broad concept of friction. Now, when our attempt will be to solve a lot of problems on friction. So some of the useful points which we must understand and remember are these. One is frictional force always acts at the surface. Naturally, it is function of the surface contact. Now, direction of frictional force is always opposite to the motion or the tendency of motion. See, when I try to move one surface against other, whether I move it or not, friction gets created, and the direction of frictional force is always opposing to what I want to do. If I want to move to right, frictional force will be directed towards left. If I want to move to left, frictional force will be directed towards right. Now, a lot of experiments were conducted, and it was found that frictional force is proportional to normal reaction given out at the surface. See, at any surface when other surface touches it, normal reaction is given out on the surface. And frictional force at the surface, the experiments have shown that it is proportional to this value of normal reaction. Now, consider proportionality is called coefficient of friction and is denoted usually by mu, and therefore we can write friction as mu r, where r is normal reaction at the surface. Now, as we've been discussing, there are two types of friction, statics and dynamics. So naturally, there is mu s is coefficient of there is a coefficient of static friction, which is usually denoted by mu s, and there is coefficient of dynamic friction, which is usually denoted by mu d. Static friction is always greater than dynamic, is always greater. But which one? The maximum static friction. Mind you, look at this graph. Let's say two surfaces are in contact and I increase the force. Frictional force also which get developed keeps increasing. But there is a limit. There's something like maximum static friction, which is always greater than the dynamic friction. So what happens? The frictional force goes on increasing, there is a sort of hum, and then there is a slight reduction, and then on there is a dynamic friction. So that's what we mean by maximum. In fact, this should be static friction is all, but a maximum static friction is always greater than dynamic friction. That's what we have to remember while solving the problems. Now this much input is good enough to actually start attempting looking at the problems which we are doing in next videos. Thank you.